My son sent me a text on the eve of his wedding that shattered my heart and then sealed his fate. Dad, do not come tomorrow. Brianna says, your blue-collar vibe will embarrass her family. I did not reply. I did not call. I simply opened my laptop and clicked one button that turned their dream wedding into a nightmare. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a can of boot polish and a worn cloth. The smell of wax and leather hung in the room, blending with that faint trace of sawdust that never really washes off a man like me. It was a Friday night in my modest house on the outskirts of Houston. The mortgage is long gone. The place is still. It has been quiet like this since my wife Elaine passed away 5 years ago. There on the back of the kitchen door hung my Navy suit. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories, a place where people who have been pushed too far finally find their footing again. If stories like this one speak to something in you, I'd be glad if you'd subscribe and hit that like button. And before we begin, drop a comment below and tell me, do you think a man like Vern had any choice but to act the way he did, or could this have ended differently? I want to hear your instinct. A quick note. Before we get started, some details in this story have been shaped for the audio format, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth inside the telling. It was 10 years old, but I had it dry cleaned just for the next day. My son Colton was getting married, as I am 66 years old, and my name is Vern McCready. I worked the cloth in small circles over the toe of my dress shoe. I wanted to look presentable. I am a retired contractor. I gave 40 years of my life with cracked hands and a sore back pouring concrete and framing houses so that my son would never have to. I wanted him to have the soft hands of a man who signs checks, not the rough hands of a man who cashes them. And I succeeded. Colton is 28. He wears suits that cost more than my first car. He drives a BMW that I pay for, though he tells his friends he bought it with his bonus. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 7:30 in the evening. I was expecting a call. Maybe a little excitement, maybe a thank you. I had wired $85,000 to the wedding venue, the Magnolia Grand, just 48 hours earlier. It was the deposit and the final payment all in one. Brianna, my future daughter-in-law, had insisted on the Magnolia Grand. She said it was the only place that met her standards. My phone buzzed on the table. The vibration rattled against the oak wood. I wiped my hands on a paper towel and reached for it. A smile crossed my face. It was a text from Colton. I put on my reading glasses. I read the message. Then I read it again. Then I took my glasses off and cleaned them and put them back on and read it a third time. Dad, I am so sorry. But Brianna is really stressed. She says, having you there will make her anxious. Her family is very high society from New York, and well, you're a bit too working class. They are uncomfortable around people who look like they labor. It is better if you do not come. I will send you photos. Love, Colton. I stared at the phone until the screen went dark. The silence in the kitchen came down fast and total. It felt like the air had been pulled clean out of the room. Too working class. Those words bounced around my skull. I looked at my hands. They are calloused. I have a scar on my left thumb from a table saw accident in '98. I have a permanent tan on my neck from years under the summer sun. These hands poured the foundation of the house Colton grew up in. These hands changed his diapers when Elaine was sick. These hands signed the checks for his private school and his college tuition. And these hands signed the check for $85,000 the day before. I did not feel anger at first. What settled in my gut was cold and heavy, like a stone dropping into still water. It was the feeling of a man who understands he has been building on a sinkhole for 28 years. Colton did not even have the courage to call me. He sent a text. He dismissed his father, the man who had been his only parent for the last 5 years, with a text message. Brianna, I thought about her. She is 26. She carries herself like royalty. She told Colton she comes from old money. She speaks with a manufactured accent she picked up from watching television. She treats waiters like servants, and Colton trails after her like a puppy. He is weak. I raised him to be kind, but somewhere down the road, kindness curdled into weakness. I got to my feet. My knees popped. I crossed to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of beer, then set it back. This moment called for something stronger. I went to the cabinet and poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass. I drank it in one swallow. The burn brought me back. I looked at the suit hanging on the door. It looked like a costume now. A costume for a clown who believed he was part of the family. I walked over to it. I lifted the hanger off the hook. I carried it to the hall closet and pushed it to the very back behind my winter coats. I would not be needing a suit tomorrow. I walked back to the kitchen table. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over the call button. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him how he could do this. But then I stopped. What was the point? If I had to beg my own son to want me at his wedding, I had already lost. Dignity is the only thing a man has left when he is alone. I would not give them the satisfaction of hearing me cry. I would not give them the satisfaction of hearing me yell. I sat down at my desk in the corner of the living room. I opened my laptop. The screen threw blue light across the dim room. I logged into my bank account. Most people look at me and see an old man in a flannel shirt driving a Chevy Silverado with rust on the bumper. They see a man who cuts his own grass. They see a man who clips coupons for coffee. They do not know who I am. They do not know that 30 years ago, I built a construction supply company from nothing. They do not know that I bought land when it was cheap and sold it when it was gold. They do not know that I own 3 apartment complexes in the city and a commercial warehouse district. I retired 5 years ago, but my money did not. Colton thinks I live on a pension and Social Security. He thinks the credit card I gave him has a $5,000 limit and that I struggled to cover it. He thinks the $85,000 for the wedding was every last dollar I had saved. He thinks he is draining me dry and that I am too blinded by love to see it. He is wrong. I pulled up the transaction history. I wanted to see exactly what my working class money had bought them that week. The list was long. It was disgusting. $4,000 at Soleil Spa, 2 days prior. Brianna and her mother must have gone with the platinum package. I have not spent $4,000 on myself in the last 4 years. $12,000 to Delta Airlines. First-class tickets from New York for Brianna's parents. Colton told me they were wealthy. If they are so wealthy, why am I covering their flights? Why am I paying for them to fly in and look down at me? $3,000 at the Onyx Lounge. That was last night, the rehearsal dinner. I was not invited to the rehearsal dinner either. Colton told me it was just for the bridal party, but right there in the charges I could see 20 people. 20 people eating steak and lobster on my tab while I ate a ham sandwich alone in my kitchen. I scrolled further. $500 for a limousine service. Pickup scheduled for tomorrow morning at the airport. That had to be for the wealthy parents who cannot manage their own ride. And then the big one, pending $85,000. The Magnolia Grand. I stared at that number. That was a college education. That was a house in some parts of the country. That was the blood and sweat of my life. And they were spending it on a party where I was not welcome. I checked the date. I had initiated the transfer the morning before. It was an ACH transfer. Most people assume these are instant. They are not. It takes time for the funds to clear. There is a window, a narrow window, where the sender can pull back the authorization if there is an error or fraud. And this was fraud, a fraud of the heart. I moved the mouse cursor. My hand was steady. I was a sniper lining up a shot. I clicked on the $85,000 transaction. A menu appeared. I selected dispute transaction. The bank site asked for a reason. I typed one word: unauthorized. It was not a lie. I authorized payment for my son's wedding. I did not authorize payment for a social event I had been barred from. The contract between a father and a son had been broken. I clicked submit. The screen refreshed. Transaction canceled. The money would not leave my account. The Magnolia Grand would get a notification come morning that the funds had failed. I was not finished. I went to the credit card tab. This was the card Colton carried in his wallet. The card he used to impress Brianna. The card he used to buy her love. I checked the balance. He had run up $20,000 in the last month alone. Flowers, suits, jewelry. I clicked on Manage Authorized Users. His name was right there, Colton McCready. Beside it sat a toggle switch marked Active. I clicked it. The status flipped to inactive. But I wanted to be certain. I wanted to be absolutely certain that when he tried to swipe that card tomorrow for the flowers or the makeup artist or the final bar tab, it would be nothing but a brick of useless plastic. I clicked Report Lost or Stolen. The site asked if I wanted to order a replacement card. I clicked no. I leaned back in my chair. The room was quiet, but inside my head I could hear the sound of a guillotine dropping. I closed the browser tab for the bank. Then I opened my email. There was a message from the landlord of the house on Sycamore Lane. This is the house Colton and Brianna live in. They think they rent it from a property management company. They have no idea that I own it. I bought it through an LLC 3 years ago, so they would have a decent place to live. I have been covering the gap in their rent ever since. They pay $1,000 a month. The going rate is $3,000. I moved the difference from one pocket to the other just to keep the ledger straight. I drafted an email to the property manager. His name is Greer. He is also my lawyer and an old friend. Subject line eviction notice. Greer, prepare a 30-day notice for the tenants on Sycamore Lane. Also, I am raising the rent to market value effective immediately for any lease renewal. No exceptions. Send it tomorrow morning. Vern. I clicked send. It was done. In the span of 10 minutes, I had dismantled the financial fantasy my son had been living in. I shut the laptop. A strange feeling came over me. I had expected guilt. A father should protect his child, but a father should also shape his child. And I had failed to teach Colton gratitude. I had failed to teach him respect. So now life would have to do it, and life is a merciless teacher. I walked back to the kitchen. I rinsed my bourbon glass and set it in the drying rack. I tucked the boot polish away under the sink. My phone started buzzing again. I walked over and looked at it. It was Colton calling. He must have been at a bar or a club, maybe celebrating his last night of freedom. Or maybe his card had just been declined for a round of drinks. The screen lit up with his face, a picture from a fishing trip 5 years ago. He was smiling. I was smiling. We looked like a team. I watched the phone rattle against the table. Buzz, buzz, buzz. It stopped. Then a text came through. Dad called me back. My card is not working. I read those words carefully. He did not ask if I was all right. He did not apologize for the text that had banned me from his wedding. He reached out only because his line to my money had been cut. That was everything I needed to know. I pressed and held the power button on the side of the phone until the screen went dark and the little spinning wheel vanished. I switched off the kitchen light. I walked down the hallway toward my bedroom. I passed the photos lining the wall. Photos of Elaine, photos of Colton at graduation, photos of the life I believed I had built. I lay down on my bed. The sheets were cool against my skin. I drew the blanket up to my chin. Tomorrow was going to be a very bad day for Colton McCready. Tomorrow he was going to wake up and pull on a tuxedo he probably hadn't fully paid for yet. He was going to show up at a venue expecting an $85,000 payment that was never coming. He was going to stand in front of his high society in-laws with a frozen credit card and a lie about to blow up in his face. And I would not be there to fix it. I closed my eyes. For the first time in 28 years, I did not lie awake worrying about my son. I did not worry about his future. I had done everything I could. I drifted off to sleep, listening to the wind outside. It sounded like a storm rolling in. But for the first time, the storm was not aimed at my house. It was aimed at his. The sun was just starting to burn through the morning mist hanging over the manicured lawns of my neighborhood. It was 7 in the morning, on the day my son was supposed to get married. Most fathers in my position would be working on a Windsor knot, or checking their watch, or nursing a cup of coffee while going over the speech in their heads. I was standing in my front yard yanking the starter cord on my 18-year-old Husqvarna lawnmower. The engine coughed, then roared to life a loud mechanical snarl that tore through the quiet of the street. I loved that sound. It was the sound of work. It was the sound of something you could count on. That machine had never let me down. Unlike the people who were about to show up, I adjusted my hat, pulling the brim low, and set off across the grass. The smell of gasoline and freshly cut clover rose up around me. It was grounding. It reminded me of who I was. I was Vern McCready. I built things. I fixed things. And today I was going to tear something down. I was halfway through the second row when I heard the screech, that unmistakable sound of high-performance rubber being punished against hot asphalt. I didn't look up right away. I held my pace hand steady on the mower handle, feeling the vibration work through my palms. But I recognized that sound. I recognized the engine note behind it. It was a BMW M5, a machine that cost north of $100,000. I knew the exact price because I had written the check for it 2 years ago when Colton said he needed something dependable for client meetings. The black sedan whipped around the corner far too fast for a residential street and locked up the brakes right in front of my driveway. The tires left thick black skid marks across the pavement I had sealed myself the previous summer. I stopped the mower. I did not kill the engine. I just let it idle the motor, turning over in a steady rhythm, while I leaned on the handle and waited. The driver's door burst open. Colton scrambled out. He looked like a disaster. His hair was unwashed, standing up in clumps, and he had on a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked nothing like a man hours away from marrying into high society. He looked like a boy who had lost his mother in a grocery store. Then the passenger door swung open. Brianna stepped out. She had on a cream velour tracksuit that probably cost more than my lawnmower and oversized sunglasses covering half her face. She slammed the door hard enough to rock the car on its suspension. That tightened my jaw. "You don't slam the door of a car you didn't pay for." "Vern," she screamed. Her voice was sharp cutting, right through the mower's rumble. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I reached down and flipped the switch. The engine died. The silence that followed was thick. I drew a slow breath, taking in the gasoline smell one last time before turning to face them. I pulled a cloth from my back pocket and dragged it across my forehead. I did not say a word. I just looked at them. Colton came jogging up the driveway, his loafers sliding on the loose grass clippings. "Dad," he panted, pulling up a few feet short of me. "Dad, you have to pick up the phone. Why is your phone off? Do you have any idea what is happening?" I looked at him without any rush. "I am cutting the grass, Colton. I like to focus when I work." Brianna came up close behind him. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at her phone, hammering away with manicured nails before thrusting the screen toward my face. "Declined," she hissed. "Declined. Do you understand what that word means?" Vern, I was at the salon. I was in the chair. They had just finished the extensions. My hair was still wet. And when I handed them the card, the machine beeped. It beeped loud. Every head in the place turned. The stylist, the other customers, all of them. She moved in closer right into my space. She smelled of expensive chemicals and desperation. It said stolen. She said the word like it was something shameful. The machine said the card was reported stolen. They treated me like a thief. They threatened to call the police, Vern. I had to get my father on the phone to pay from a distance. My father on my wedding day. I folded the cloth and slid it back in my pocket. "That sounds embarrassing," I said. My voice was flat, not a trace of sympathy in it. "Embarrassing," she shrieked. "It was humiliating. You need to call the bank right now. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you are an old fool who pressed the wrong button. Fix this." Colton stepped between us, hands raised in a calming gesture. "Dad, please. We don't have time for this. The florist is waiting on the final payment. The limousine company needs the deposit for the airport pickup. There are vendors lined up all morning waiting to be paid. Just unlock the card. We can sit down and talk through whatever is bothering you after the wedding. Whatever is bothering me." That phrase just hung there in the air. He thought this was a mood. He thought this was a senior moment. He had no idea the ground had already shifted under his feet. I looked at my son. I watched the panic working across his face. It wasn't the panic of a man worried about his father. It was the panic of an addict cut off from his supply. "I am not calling the bank," I said. Colton blinked. "What I said, I am not calling the bank. That card wasn't declined by accident. Colton, I reported it stolen." Brianna made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a growl. "You what? Why on earth would you do that?" "Because I worked something out last night," I said, folding my arms across my chest. "I worked out that only a thief takes $85,000 from a man and then tells him he isn't fit to sit at the same table." Colton's face drained of color. He finally understood. This wasn't a glitch. This was an answer. "Dad, come on." He stumbled over the words, his voice falling to a near whisper. "You got the text." "Look, I am sorry, all right? It is complicated. Brianna's family is different. They have a certain way about them. We just wanted the day to be perfect. We didn't want you feeling out of place." "Out of place," I repeated back. "You are standing in the driveway of the house I built. You are driving a car I paid for. The clothes on your back, I covered those too. And you think I am the one who is out of place." Brianna scoffed, rolling her eyes behind those dark glasses. "Oh, here we go. The martyr act. Listen, Vern, we don't have time for your little blue-collar pity party right now. We have guests coming in from the Hamptons. We have a schedule to keep. You are blowing everything up because your fragile ego took a bruise. Just hand over the money and go back to your yard work. You're right, you don't belong with my family. Look at yourself. You are covered in grass clippings. You look like the help. The help." I glanced down at my boots, old work boots scuffed and dark with oil and mud. I looked at my flannel shirt worn thin at the elbows. Then I looked past both of them at the BMW sitting out in the street. That car had meant something to me the day I bought it. I had taken on an extra 6 months of consulting work just to pay cash for it, so Colton wouldn't be dragging around a car payment. I put the title in my own name for insurance purposes, but I let him drive it like it belonged to him. I let him play the big shot. "You know, Brianna," I said, dropping my voice a full octave. "You are absolutely right. I am the help. I am the help that covers your rent. I am the help that funds your vacations. and I am the help that paid for the car you just slammed the door of. I stepped past them and headed down the driveway toward the street. Where are you going? Colton called after me, his voice climbing. Dad, where are you going? I walked up to the BMW. I laid my hand across the hood. The metal was warm from the engine. I looked at the tires. Pirelli P0s, $600 a corner. I had paid for those as well. I reached into my pocket and found my key ring. I carry a spare for every vehicle I own. I hit the unlock button. The lights blinked. I pulled open the driver's door. Dad, what are you doing? Colton shouted, coming at a run. We need that car. We are supposed to pick up the groomsmen in an hour. I settled into the driver's seat. The leather was soft. It carried the smell of Colton's cologne mixed with Brianna's perfume. It smelled like entitlement. I turned the key. The dash lit up. Get out of the car, Vern. Brianna screamed, clattering down the driveway in her heels. That is our car. You cannot take our car. I rolled the window down as they closed in. I looked at Colton. He had both hands wrapped around the door handle, knuckles going white. It is not your car, Colton, I said. It never belonged to you. It is my car. My name is on the title. My name is on the insurance policy. And since I have been told I am not welcome at the wedding, I see no reason my car should be welcome either. Dad, you cannot do this, Colton said, his eyes going glassy. How are we supposed to get to the venue? How are we supposed to get anywhere? I don't know, I said, dropping the car into gear. Maybe you call Brianna's wealthy father. I'm sure he has a spare limousine somewhere. Or maybe you take the bus. It is very affordable, very working class. I didn't wait around for a reply. I pressed the accelerator. The car pulled away, leaving the two of them in the middle of the street. I checked the mirror on my way out. Colton was standing there with his arms hanging loose at his sides, looking hollowed out. Brianna had her hands in the air, screaming at the empty spot where the car had just been. I drove around the block and pulled the BMW into my garage. The door came down behind me. I went back inside and turned the deadbolt on the front door. I went to the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee. My hands had a slight tremor, not from fear but from adrenaline. I had fired the opening shot, but the war still had a long way to go. I sat at the table and picked up my phone. It was buzzing again. This time, it wasn't Colton. It was the landline. I let it ring. I knew exactly what was coming. They would try to regroup. They would head back to the apartment. They would tear through whatever they could find to scrape up quick cash. They were on their way to the house on Sycamore Lane. And they had no idea the locks on that house were being swapped out in exactly 20 minutes. I took a sip of coffee. It was bitter just the way I like it. This was shaping up to be a long day, but for the first time in years, I was genuinely looking forward to what came next. They wanted a show. They wanted a flawless high society wedding. Well, I was going to give them a show they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. I was going to demonstrate exactly what happens when the help decides to walk off the job. The phone stopped ringing. The quiet settled back in, but it wasn't peaceful quiet. It was the quiet of a fuse burning down, and the blast at the end was going to be something. I pushed back from the table and went to the window. I watched them moving off down the street away from my house. They were fighting. Brianna was shoving Colton. Colton was reaching for her arm. They looked small from up here, small and petty and lost. They were heading in the direction of the bus stop. I nearly felt sorry for them. Nearly. But then the text came back to me, "Don't come. You're too working class." I turned away from the window. I had things to do. I had a wedding to crash, and I needed to make sure I was turned out right, because if I was going to be the villain in their story, I was going to be the best-dressed villain they had ever laid eyes on. I walked to the closet and took out the navy suit. I laid it flat on the bed. I smoothed my hand over the fabric. Good quality. Durable, just like me. The game had changed, and they didn't yet know the rules. I stood in my kitchen a while longer, letting the stillness of the house settle over me, but it didn't last long. The pounding on the front door started less than 10 minutes after I had taken the BMW back, a hard, frantic rhythm that rattled the frame. They had not gone to the bus stop after all. They had turned around. They had understood finally that without me they were stranded in a suburb with no money, no car, and a countdown ticking toward total humiliation. I finished the last of my coffee. I set the mug in the sink. I made my way slowly to the front door. I did not rush. I was done rushing for people who would not lift a finger for me. I threw the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Colton was on the step chest, heaving face slick with sweat. Brianna stood a pace behind him, arms locked across her chest, that expensive tracksuit looking absurd against the faded paint of my porch railing. She looked like an angry flamingo in a coal mine. "You have to stop this, Dad," Colton said, his voice breaking. "You are taking this way too far. It was just a text. It was just a simple request. We never meant to hurt your feelings, but you are behaving like a lunatic. Give us the keys. Turn the cards back on. We have less than an hour before the ceremony." I leaned against the doorframe and blocked the entrance. I studied my son. He was 28 years old, but standing there in that moment, he looked like a toddler melting down in a toy aisle. "I am not behaving like a lunatic, Colton," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "I am behaving like a man who just saved himself $85,000. Brianna shouldered past Colton and moved to the front. Her face had twisted into a sneer that pulled at the filler lines around her mouth. "Listen to me, you selfish old man," she spat. "You think this is some kind of game. You think you can hold us hostage. You are pathetic. This is my wedding, my day, and you are destroying it because you are too thin-skinned to handle the truth." "And what is the truth, Brianna?" I asked. "The truth is that you are an embarrassment," she screamed. "Look at you. Look at this house. It reeks of old grease and sawdust. You wear clothes off a thrift store rack. You drive a truck that belongs in a salvage yard. My parents are refined people. They are flying in from New York. They move in circles you could never hope to enter. Do you honestly think I want them to see you standing beside us in photographs? Do you think I want to explain to my friends that my father-in-law digs ditches for a living? I stood there and let her words come. They were built to wound. They were aimed to cut me down, but they didn't land the way she intended. They just made things clearer. They scraped away the final layer of doubt I'd been carrying. "I don't dig ditches, Brianna," I said. "I own the company that digs the ditches and the company that pours the concrete and the company that puts up the walls. But you never had any interest in that, did you? The only thing you ever cared about was the checkbook." "I don't care what you own," she hissed. "You are low-class, Vern. You always have been. You are cheap. You are tacky. And frankly, we were doing you a courtesy by including you at all. But now you are going to make this right. You are going to give us the money because you owe it to Colton. You owe him a future." "I owe him nothing," I said. "I gave him a life. I gave him an education. I gave him a home. And in return, he gave me a text message telling me to stay away." Colton tried to step in. "She didn't mean it, Dad. She is just under pressure." "Oh, be quiet, Colton." Brianna cut him off. "Stop making excuses for him. He needs to hear this." She turned back to me, her eyes burning. "You are going to pay for this wedding, Vern. You are going to cover every single cent, because if you don't, I will make sure you never set eyes on your son again. I will see to it that you die alone in this miserable little house." I looked at her. I looked at the greed and entitlement coming off her like heat rising from summer asphalt. And then I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the night before. "Why?" I asked. "What?" she snapped. "Why should I pay for a party I have been banned from attending?" She blinked. The question seemed to knock her sideways. "Because it is your obligation," she said. "Because that is what parents do. They pay." "No," I said. "Parents provide, fools pay, and I am finished being a fool." I reached into my pocket and brought out my phone. Old model cracked screen. Brianna looked at it like it had crawled out from under something. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Making a call?" I said. I unlocked the screen. I went through my contacts. I don't have many, but the ones in there are worth having. I found the number for Prestige Limousines. I knew the owner. His name was Rocco. We had sat at the same poker table for 20 years. I put the phone on speaker and held it up between us. Brianna's eyes went wide. She recognized the name on the screen. The line rang once, twice. "Vern?" Rocco's voice filled the space between us. "Good to hear from you. Are we all set for the pickup?" "Hello, Rocco," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on Brianna's face. "I am calling about the reservation for the McCready wedding, the stretch Hummer, and the 2 town cars for the airport run." "Yes, sir," Rocco said. "My drivers are at Bush Intercontinental right now. The flight from New York just touched down. We are waiting at baggage claim." I watched the color leave Brianna's face. Her parents, her wealthy, polished parents, were coming through arrivals right now, expecting a driver with a sign. "Rocco," I said, "there has been a change of plans." "What kind of change, Vern?" Rocco asked. "I need you to cancel the service," I said. "Cancel it." Rocco sounded thrown. "Vern, my drivers are already on the floor. The clock is running." "I know, Rocco." I said, "Bill me for the cancellation fee. Whatever it comes to, put it on my account, but do not pick up those passengers." Vern, are you sure? Rocco asked. It is a wedding day. I am sure, Rocco, I said. The card on file for incidentals was my son's, and it has been reported stolen. I am also withdrawing my personal guarantee on the contract. Send the drivers back. A pause settled over the line. Then Rocco let out a long breath. All right, Vern, you are the boss. I will radio them to clear the terminal. Sorry about the mess. No trouble, Rocco. Thank you. I ended the call. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence, not the quiet of a fuse burning down. This was the silence of a charge that had already gone off. Brianna made a sound that did not belong to any human register, a raw, guttural screech of pure panic. You didn't... She breathed, both hands flying to cover her mouth. You did not just strand my parents at Bush Intercontinental? I slid the phone back into my pocket. I did, I said. They are wealthy people, Brianna. I am confident they can manage Uber. Or there is a direct route into downtown, very clean, very reliable, very working class. My parents do not take public transportation. She screamed, launching herself forward. Colton caught her around the waist and pulled her back. She clawed at the air, reaching for my face. You monster. You have ruined everything. They will be standing on that curb like stranded travelers. They will despise me. They will despise you. They don't know me, I said. And from the way you speak about me, they most likely already do. So I have lost nothing there. Colton looked at me with eyes full of something that cut deeper than anger. Dad, how could you do that? They are guests. This is humiliating. Humiliating? I repeated. Humiliating is sitting at your own kitchen table, polishing your shoes for a wedding you were told not to show up to. Humiliating is discovering your son is ashamed of the hands that raised him. This is not humiliation, Colton. This is a lesson. A lesson, he shouted. You are burning my life down to teach me a lesson. I am burning down the lie you are living, I said. You wanted to play the big shot, Colton. You wanted to marry the princess. Well, big shots settle their own bills, and princesses don't marry paupers. Brianna went still in Colton's grip. She straightened up and smoothed her tracksuit. Her face shifted, the rage drained out of it, replaced by something colder, more calculating. Fine, she said. That's fine. You want to go down this road, Ver. We will go down this road. You think you can cut us off and we will fold. You are wrong. We don't need you. We have the house on Sycamore Lane. We have our wedding gifts. We will find a way through this. And when we do, you will never lay eyes on us again. You will never meet your grandchildren. You will rot away in this house alone, and no one will come. I smiled. It was a quiet, sad smile, but it was real. The house on Sycamore Lane. I said. Yes, she snapped. Our house. I checked my watch. It was 8:15. You might want to head over there, I said. Why? She asked, a new edge of suspicion in her voice. Because at 8:00 this morning, a locksmith met the property manager on site, I said. They are changing the locks as we speak. The lease was month to month and registered under my name, so I have terminated it. Colton let his arms fall from her waist. He looked as if someone had driven a fist into his chest. You evicted us, he said, barely above a whisper. I didn't evict you, I said. I simply stopped providing housing for people who are no longer family. You said it yourself, Brianna. I am just a bank account. And the bank is closed. Brianna stared at me. Her mouth moved, but nothing came out. The full weight of it was descending on her now. No car, no venue, no car service for her parents, and no place to go home to. Colton took a step back from me. He looked up at the house he had grown up in. He looked at me, his father, and for the first time I could see genuine fear behind his eyes. Not frustration, not anger, real fear. The fear of a man who realizes the floor beneath him has just given way. You are out of your mind, he said. You are actually out of your mind. Go, I said, and I pointed toward the street. Go find Brianna's parents. Go explain why they are standing on a curb at the airport. Go sort out where you are sleeping tonight. But get off my property. I stepped back inside. I closed the door. I turned the deadbolt. I pressed my forehead against the cool surface of the wood. My heart was hammering. It hurt. God, it hurt to do that to my own son. To see the hatred in his eyes. But then I looked down at my own hands. The hands that had built everything I'd ever owned. They were shaking. Not out of weakness, out of rage, out of the release of all those years I'd made myself small so he could feel tall. I walked over to the window and watched them. They were sprinting down the driveway by then. Colton had his phone out, probably trying to call a ride he had no money to pay for. Brianna was screaming at him, beating on his arm. They looked like rats abandoning a sinking ship, turning on each other as the water climbed. I watched until they rounded the corner and were gone. I was alone in my house, quiet. But it was a clean kind of quiet. The air felt like it weighed less. I went back to the kitchen. I picked up the boot polish again. I still had one shoe that needed shining. I wasn't heading to the wedding, but that didn't mean my shoes couldn't be right. A man stays ready because I knew this thing wasn't finished. They would go to the Sycamore Lane house. They'd find the locks had been changed, and then they'd figure out that the paintings on the walls, the ones my wife Elaine had painted, were gone. That's when the real war would begin. I pressed the worn cloth into the wax. Circular motions, patience, focus. I was just warming up. I drove over to the house on Sycamore Lane, 20 minutes from my place, past strip malls and new developments that had swallowed up the cornfields I used to run through as a boy. I parked my Chevy Silverado on the opposite side of the street. The house looked sharp. I'd resided it myself 3 years back, going with a sage green vinyl that cost more than most would spend but would outlast everything around it. Lawn green windows clean. A perfect starter home, the kind young couples dream about, and I'd handed it to them for what a studio apartment goes for. I saw them before I even cut the engine. They were on the front porch. Brianna was pounding on the door with the flat of her hand, screaming at the wood like it might answer her. Colton was pacing the walkway, both hands buried in his hair, wearing the face of a man who just watched his whole life burn. They hadn't gone to the airport. They hadn't checked into a hotel. They'd come here banking on me, bluffing, hoping the key still in Colton's pocket would still move the tumbler. It didn't. Greer is a solid property manager. When he says 8 onger, he means 8 euro. I stepped out of the truck. I didn't slam the door. I just pressed it shut until it clicked. That sound made Colton look up. The moment he saw me, his face shifted. Whatever fear I'd caught in him earlier had burned off, replaced by something raw and ugly. He wasn't looking at his father anymore. He was looking at an enemy. He saw the man standing between him and the life he believed he was owed. He started moving toward me at a run. No screaming, no shouting. He just dropped his head and charged. I'd seen that expression before, bar fights, job site blow-ups when the money ran dry. It was the look of a man who's lost the thread and wants to hurt something just to prove he's still breathing. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I reached into the bed of the truck and my hand wrapped around the cold rubber grip of a pair of long-handled bolt cutters. I'd tossed them back there the day before, after trimming hedges at one of my rental properties. Heavy, solid steel. Jaws sharp enough to take a finger clean off without missing a beat. I pulled them out and let them hang at my side. I didn't raise them like I was going to war. I held them the way a man holds a tool he knows exactly how to use. Colton crossed the street. Didn't slow down. He was going to hit me. My own son was going to drive me into the asphalt. I stepped forward once and snapped the jaws of the bolt cutters together. Clack, sharp, metallic. The sound cut through the morning air like a shot. Colton skidded to a stop 6 feet in front of me. He stared at the cutters. Then his eyes came up to my face. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't angry. I was cold. I looked at him with the eyes of a foreman who's just caught a worker pocketing copper wire. I looked at him with the eyes of a man who has let bigger, meaner people go without losing sleep. "Don't!" I said, low, barely above a whisper, but he heard it. "Do not take another step, Colton." He stood there, chest-pumping, fists balled at his sides. "You locked us out." He choked spit, leaving his lips. "All our stuff is in there. My suit, Brianna's dress for the reception, our passports, everything. You can't do this. It's illegal." "It is not illegal," I said evenly. "It is a lockout for non-payment of market value rent and lease violation." Greer posted the notice on the door. "Did you not read it? Moim. I don't care about the notice," he screamed, edging forward again. "Open the door, Dad. Open the damn door, or I swear to God I will." He raised a fist. I lifted the bolt cutters. I pointed the jaws straight at his chest. My arm didn't waver, steady as poured concrete. "You will what, Colton?" I asked. "You will hit me. You'll beat up the old man. Go ahead, take your shot. But remember who taught you how to fight. And remember that I spent 40 years breaking concrete while you were on the couch playing video games." He went still. He looked at the cutters, then back into my eyes. He found something there he had never seen before. He saw that the safety net had been pulled away. He saw that I wasn't his dad anymore. I was just another man. And in a fight between men, he knew which way it would go. The fury emptied out of him, leaving something hollow behind. He stepped back, his hands trembling. "You're crazy," he whispered. "You're actually threatening me." "I am not threatening you," I said, dropping the bolt cutters to my side, but keeping them ready. "I'm protecting myself. There's a difference." Brianna came flying down the lawn, her heels punching into the grass I'd paid to have fertilized. She grabbed Colton's arm, forcibly pulling him back. "Colton, stop!" she cried, eyes on me with real terror in them. "He's lost his mind. Look at him. He has a weapon. We have to go." "We have to go. We can call the police later. We need to get to the venue. My parents are probably already there. We have to salvage this." She was right. The clock was moving. Every minute they burned here fighting me was another minute closer to their social funeral. I watched them fall back. They retreated toward the sidewalk like I was something rabid. "Listen to me," I called out, my voice carrying down the block. "I'm giving you 24 hours. They stopped, looked back. 24 hours, I repeated. "Greer will be here tomorrow at noon. He'll open that door for exactly 60 minutes. You come and take your clothes and your personal things. Anything still in there, after that goes to the dump." "But the furniture," Brianna wailed. "The TV, the wedding gifts." "The furniture is mine," I said. "I bought it. The TV is mine. I bought it. The gifts, you can have the gifts. You're gonna want to return them for cash once you figure out you've got nowhere to sleep." I moved one step toward them, and they both flinched. "Now get off my property," I said. "Get off my street. Go play pretend with your rich in-laws. See how far that carries you." Colton held my gaze one last time. There was no love left in it, only hate, pure, undiluted hate. And that was fine by me. I could carry hate. What I couldn't carry was disrespect. "Come on, Brianna," he said, taking her hand. "Let's go. We'll work through this. We don't need him." They turned and headed down the street toward the main road, at a near run, probably looking to flag a cab, or find a signal to call a ride they couldn't afford. I watched them until they were gone. I stood in the street with the bolt cutters in my hand, feeling the heft of the steel. Across the way, Mrs. Pickett had eased back a corner of her curtains to look. I gave her a nod. She let the curtain drop. I walked up the driveway to the house. Up to the front door, I looked over the notice Greer had taped to it. Notice of lease termination? It looked official. It looked final. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the master key. I didn't need to wait for Greer. I owned the place. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air inside was stale. It smelled of expensive candles and neglect. Clothes were thrown across every surface, pizza boxes stacked on the coffee table. It looked like a fraternity house, not a home where a married couple was supposed to be building a life. I moved through the living room. I didn't look at the mess. I looked at the walls. Empty spaces stared back at me, rectangular patches where the paint was a shade brighter than everything around them. I stopped cold. My heart lurched. I moved to the hallway. More bare patches. I went to the bedroom. Above the bed where I had hung it with my own hands 3 years ago, there should have been a painting, a landscape of the lake cabin we used to rent every summer. Elaine had painted it the summer before she got sick. It wasn't a masterpiece the world would recognize, but to me, it was everything. It was her soul pressed onto canvas. It was gone. I looked around the room, eyes darting. The painting of the flowers gone. The sketch of Colton as a boy gone. I crossed to the jewelry box on the dresser. Open, empty. Elaine's pearl necklace, the one I'd given her for our 30th anniversary. Gone. My blood went cold. Then it caught fire. They hadn't just been living off me. They had been selling me off one piece at a time. I looked down at the floor. Half tucked under the bed was a piece of paper. I picked it up. A receipt, yellow carbon copy, Capital City pawn and lone gold items, 3 oil paintings, amateur, 1 pearl necklace, 1 gold watch. Total cash payout, $1,200. I stared at that number. $200. They had sold my wife's legacy. They had sold the only pieces of her I had left for $1,200, probably to upgrade the floral arrangements or book a better DJ. The sadness burned off instantly. The hesitation went with it. This wasn't about a wedding anymore. This wasn't about disrespect. This was a crime. I took out my phone. I called Greer. "Vern," he answered. "I changed the locks. They're out." "I know Greer," I said. My voice was unsteady, but not from fear. "I'm inside the house. I need you to do something for me, and I need it done fast." "What is it, Vern?" Draft a criminal complaint, theft, grand larceny. Vern, are you sure it's your son? I looked at the empty space on the wall where Elaine's painting had hung. I pressed my hand flat against it. The wall was cold. He isn't my son right now, I said. Right now he's a thief. Get the papers together and call the police. Tell them to meet me at the Magnolia Grand. You're going to the wedding? Greer asked. Yes, I said. I'm going to the wedding. I have a gift to deliver. I hung up. I put the receipt in my pocket. I walked out of the house and locked the door behind me. I got back in my truck. I had work to do. I pulled the Chevy Silverado up to the curb in front of the house on Sycamore Lane and cut the engine. The silence that settled in was heavy, the kind that usually precedes a storm. I sat there for a moment, both hands on the steering wheel, eyes on the house. It was a good house, a solid house. I'd bought it out of foreclosure 3 years ago and spent 6 months bringing it back with my own 2 hands. Sanded the floors, hung the drywall, installed the new windows. It was supposed to be a gift, a launching pad for Colton and Brianna to start building something real. Now it sat there looking like a fortress locked against its own owner. I stepped out and walked up the driveway. The concrete was streaked with oil stains that Colton had never once thought to clean. I reached into my pocket and found my key ring. I picked out the brass key, the master, the one I'd kept for emergencies. I slid it into the lock. It went in halfway and stopped. I jiggled it, tried to work it through. It hit solid metal. They had changed the locks. I stood on that porch staring at the deadbolt. A low sound escaped me, something between a laugh and a cough, but there was no amusement behind it. It was the sound of pure disbelief. They lived in my house rent-free. They drove my vehicles. They spent my money. And when we had a disagreement, their move was to change the locks on a property that didn't belong to them. The sheer audacity of it was almost something to marvel at. They genuinely believed that possession was 9/10 of the law. They believed that if they could keep me out, they could keep the fantasy running. I took out my phone. I didn't call Colton. I didn't call Brianna. There was no point yelling through a locked door. Instead, I scrolled to a number I hadn't dialed in a while. Dex the locksmith picked up on the second ring. "Vern," he said, "what can I do for you?" I need you at Sycamore Lane, Dex," I said. "Bring the drill and a fresh set of deadbolts, the heavy-duty kind." I waited on the porch. I didn't pace. I didn't peer through the windows. I stood there like a man keeping watch. Neighbors rolled past in their cars, slowing when they spotted me there in my work clothes. I didn't wave. I had no interest in pleasantries. I was interested in getting through that door. Dex showed up in 15 minutes. He was a big man who'd been cracking locks and opening safes in this city for 30 years. He took one look at me, then one look at the door. He didn't ask a single question. He knew who held the deed. He knew who paid the bills. "Lose your keys, Vern?" he asked, pulling a heavy drill from his van. "Something like that," I said. "The tenants decided to make some unauthorized modifications. I need to inspect the property." Dex gave a nod. He stepped up to the door. The drill bit into the metal with a shriek, loud and violent, boring straight through the pins of the lock Colton had probably paid a premium to have installed just hours before. Metal shavings curled down onto the welcome mat. Less than 2 minutes. With a final crunch, the lock gave up. Dex worked a screwdriver into the mechanism, and the door swung open. "Thanks, Dex," I said, pressing a wad of cash into his hand. "Put the new ones in and give me the only set of keys." I crossed the threshold. The smell hit me before anything else, a thick, suffocating blend of stale champagne, expensive perfume, and rotting garbage. It smelled like a party that had lasted too long and ended badly. The blinds were down, leaving the living room in a dim, dusty half-light. I reached over and flipped the switch. What I saw was total devastation, not the kind that comes from a single moment of rage, the kind that builds from sustained casual indifference, which was somehow worse. Clothes were everywhere, designer jackets draped over chair backs, silk dresses pooled on the floor like spilled oil, shoeboxes stacked in leaning towers against the walls. Takeout containers covered the coffee table, a few of them alive with flies. I moved further into the room. My boot crunched down on something hard. I looked. A crystal flute shattered across the floor. I stepped over it. This was how they actually lived. This was the truth behind the polished Instagram photos and the high society performance. They lived like squatters in a palace, treating my property the way they treated me, with total and complete disregard for its worth. I went into the kitchen. The sink was buried under dishes. A bottle of Dom Perignon sat on the counter, uncorked and half empty, going flat in the heat. I looked at the granite countertops I'd installed myself. Ring marks, stains. I looked at the cabinets. One of the doors hung loose off its hinge. A cold fury climbed in my chest. This wasn't just messy. This was ungrateful. Every stain, every scratch, every piece of trash left lying around was proof of how little all of it meant to them, all the work I had done, all the years I had put in. But then something else caught my eye, something that made the mess look minor by comparison. I walked back into the living room, back to the walls. When I'd handed them the house, I'd left a few things behind, furniture mostly, but also art. Elaine had been a painter, not a professional, but she had a way of catching light that made a room feel softer, made the world look like it was worth stopping for. She had painted the places we'd traveled together, the lakes, the mountains, the quiet corners where we'd been happy. I looked at the spot above the fireplace, a large rectangular patch of wall, the paint there noticeably cleaner and brighter than the rest. The painting of the shoreline in the Carolinas was gone. I spun around. The wall by the hallway, the wildflower field. Gone. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Not the frantic drum of panic, the slow, heavy thud of dread. I sprinted down the hallway, kicking a pile of laundry out of my path. I shoved open the door to the master bedroom. The bed was a tangle of expensive unmade sheets. Before I tell you what I found inside those walls, what my own son had really been willing to do, let me ask you this: if someone you had given everything to quietly betrayed that trust, would you confront them face to face, or would you let the evidence speak for itself? Suitcases lay open on the floor, half packed like they'd been interrupted mid-flight. But I wasn't thinking about that. I looked at the wall above the dresser. Elaine's self-portrait, the one she'd painted for me on our 25th anniversary, the one where she was wearing that private smile, the smile she only ever gave to me. It was gone. I stood in the center of the room and turned slowly a full circle. The walls were stripped bare. Every piece of art, every last trace of my wife had been taken. The hooks still hung there, naked accusing. I went for the closet, threw the doors open, pulled out the drawers of the jewelry cabinet I'd built directly into the wall. Empty, Elaine's pearl necklace, her diamond earrings, the gold watch I'd given her when Colton was born. All of it gone. I couldn't get air into my lungs. The room felt like the oxygen had been evacuated from it. They hadn't just lived off me. They hadn't just disrespected me. They had looted me. They had taken the only pieces of Elaine I had left, the pieces I had trusted them to keep safe, and stripped the place clean. Why would they take the paintings? They weren't famous. They weren't worth a fortune at auction. They were sentimental. They were family, unless they needed cash fast. Unless they needed money to cover the flowers, the limo, the champagne tower at the wedding I hadn't been invited to. I went down on my knees. I tore through the room, ripped the sheets off the bed, dumped the suitcases out onto the floor. I was searching for something, anything that would show me what they'd done. I checked the nightstand drawers, empty except for loose change and a few crumpled receipts. Receipts. I grabbed a fistful of papers from the trash bin beside the bed, smoothed them flat. Pizza delivery, dry cleaning, a parking ticket. And then I saw it. A yellow slip of carbon paper crumpled into a ball and thrown away like it meant nothing. I unfolded it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady enough to read. The logo at the top showed a pair of scales. Capital City Pawn and Loan. I read down the itemized list. Item 1, oil painting, coastal landscape. Item 2, oil painting, floral study. Item 3, oil painting, portrait. Item 4, vintage pearl necklace. Item 5, gold lady's watch. I looked at the total payout. $1.200. They had sold my wife's soul. They had sold 40 years of memory. They had sold the legacy of a woman who had loved Colton more than she loved her own life. And they had done it all for $1.200 probably to cover the appetizers or the upgrade to the bridal suite. I sat on the floor with that yellow slip of paper in my hands. The rage that had been burning inside me changed into something different. It turned to ice. It became a resolve so cold and so dense it scared me. This was no longer a family dispute. This wasn't about a wedding invitation or a frozen bank account. This was a crime. I got to my feet. I placed the receipt in my pocket. I looked around the room one last time. I looked at the bare walls. I didn't see my son's bedroom. I saw a crime scene. I walked out, down the hallway, past the locksmith finishing up the new deadbolt installation. "Lock it all up, Dex," I said. My voice came out steady. "Lock it tight. Nobody gets through that door, not even if they plead." I walked out to my truck. I pulled out my phone. I dialed. Greer picked up on the first ring. "Vern, did you get inside?" he asked. "Yeah, I got in," I said. "Greer, I need something from you, and I need it right now." "What is it, Vern?" "I'm holding a pawn receipt," I said. "Colton stole his mother's jewelry. He took her paintings and pawned every last one of them." Silence on the line. When Greer spoke again, his voice was grave. "Vern, that's grand larceny. If we go down this road, he's looking at jail time." I looked at the house. I looked at the window where Elaine used to stand and wave at me when I came home from work. "Draft the complaint, Greer," I said. "Call the precinct. Tell them I want to press charges and tell them to meet me at the Magnolia Grand." "You're going to the venue?" Greer asked. "Yes," I said, turning the key in the ignition. "I'm going to the venue. The police can pick him up there." "Vern, think about what you're doing," Greer said. "Showing up at the wedding to have him arrested, that's the nuclear option." I put the truck in gear. "They sold Elaine for under $200, Greer. The nuclear option is the only one I've got left." I hung up. I didn't look back at the house. I pointed the truck toward the city. The sun was riding high. It was a beautiful day for a wedding, and it was a beautiful day for justice. I stood in the center of that master bedroom, and the silence of the house pressed down like something with weight. The pale rectangular patches on the walls where Elaine's paintings had hung looked like fresh scars, wounds, voids where the soul of this place used to live. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with grief. I needed more than suspicion. I needed the paper trail. I needed to see exactly what they had done in their own handwriting, on their own receipts. I walked over to the desk in the corner. It was a cheap particle board thing that Brianna had insisted on buying because it looked modern, even though I'd offered to build them something solid in oak. The surface was buried under an avalanche of paper. Unopened envelopes, glossy wedding magazines, brochures for luxury honeymoons in the Maldives. A shrine to their delusion. I started going through it. I wasn't careful about it. I swept the magazines off with one arm. I grabbed handfuls of mail and tore them open. Past due notice from the electric company. Final warning from the credit card company. A letter from a collections agency on a personal loan. It was a financial autopsy. They weren't just broke. They were drowning, going under beneath the weight of a life they had no business living. And they were using this wedding as a last gasp of air, betting everything that the gift envelopes would dig them out, or that I would die and leave them the rest. I pulled open the top drawer, jammed with takeout menus and charging cables. I yanked harder. It jumped the tracks and crashed to the floor. In the dark cavity underneath, sitting in the recess of the desk, was a shoebox. I reached in and pulled it out. An old Nike box. I lifted the lid. Inside, a tangle of papers, receipts, pawn slips. My hands were unsteady as I reached in and pulled the first one out. Dated 3 months ago. Gold cufflinks engraved VM. My cufflinks, the ones I'd given Colton at his college graduation, the ones that had belonged to my father, before me. He had pawned them for $200. I picked up another, 2 months ago, silver tea set, antique. Elaine's tea set, the one her grandmother had carried over from Poland, sold for scrap silver. Bile climbed my throat. I dug deeper. I was after the most recent one, the one that would account for the empty walls and the hollowed-out feeling in every room. I found it at the bottom of the stack. Dated yesterday. The ink still looked fresh. Capital City Pawn and Loan. The list was long. It was a catalog of my wife's life. Item 1, oil painting coastal scene artist unknown. Item 2, oil painting floral arrangement artist unknown. Item 3, 18K gold locket with diamond chip. Item 4, pearl necklace double strand. I stared at the page. The words went blurry. The locket. I had bought that for Elaine the day we found out she was pregnant with Colton. I had worked double shifts for 6 months to afford it. I remembered the night I gave it to her. We were sitting on the floor of our first apartment eating pizza because we didn't own a table yet. She had cried. She had worn it every single day until she got sick. When the hospital made her take it off her skin, too sensitive for the metal, she had pressed it into my hand and said, "Give this to Colton's wife one day. Make sure she understands what it means." I had given it to Brianna at the engagement dinner. I had told her the whole story. I had told her it was a symbol of enduring love, and she had sold it. She had taken the emblem of my wife's devotion to her son and exchanged it for cash. I looked at the payout on the receipt. Total $1,200. That was it. That was what my memories fetched on the open market. That was the going rate for my wife's legacy. They hadn't sold these things out of desperation. They hadn't sold them to keep the lights on or buy medication. I looked at the receipt again. It was stapled to a second sheet, an invoice from a florist. Orchid arrangement upgrade, head table 1. Arrangement $200. I let out a sound that was half laugh. They had traded Elaine's locket for flowers. They had traded her paintings for centerpieces that would be wilting in a trash bin before the night was out. They had erased my wife to buy a few hours of looking wealthy in front of people who didn't give a damn about them. I sat down on the edge of the unmade bed. I held the pawn slip with both hands. The paper felt warm against my skin. For years I had made excuses for Colton. I told myself he was young. I told myself he was under pressure, still finding solid ground. I told myself that deep down, he was still the little boy who used to trail behind me on job sites with a plastic hammer in his hand. But that boy was gone. That boy had been gone a long time. The man living in this house was a stranger who would steal from his own mother's ghost to impress people who didn't know her name. I looked at the bare spot on the wall where Elaine's self-portrait had hung. I could almost see her eyes looking back at me from it. She had always been the patient one. She had always told me not to push so hard. "He's still finding his way, Vern," she would say. "Let him make his mistakes." But this wasn't a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill. A mistake is saying the wrong thing when you're angry. This was a choice. A cold, deliberate choice to value an image over a person, to value a party over a parent. This was a violation. I felt the last remaining tether give way. That invisible cord between a father and a son, that thick rope of unconditional love and duty. It frayed and then it snapped. I wasn't a father anymore. Not in this room, not with this receipt in my hand. I was a man who had been robbed. I folded the receipt carefully, creasing each edge until it was sharp and clean. I placed it in the breast pocket of my flannel shirt right over my heart. It didn't feel like paper. It felt like evidence. I stood up. My knees didn't protest this time. I felt strong. I felt cold. The grief had drained away completely. The sadness was gone. What remained was a clarity so sharp it could draw blood. I walked to the dresser and picked up a framed photo of Colton and Brianna. They were on a boat somewhere, sunglasses on, drinks in hand, all white teeth and manufactured ease. They looked perfect. They looked happy. I took the photo out of the frame. I tore it in half. Then I tore the halves. I let the pieces drift down into the mess they had made of the floor. I walked out of the bedroom. I moved down the hall past the empty patches on the walls. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. I had the receipt. I stepped through the front door and locked the new deadbolt behind me. The click of that lock sounded like a cell door closing. I walked to my truck. The sun was fully up, throwing hard light off the hood. A perfect day for a wedding. I climbed into the cab and reached for my phone. My hand was steady. I scrolled to Greer's number. I wasn't calling to vent. I wasn't calling to process. I was calling to declare war. The season for teaching lessons was finished. The season for consequences had arrived. I pressed call. Greer picked up on the first ring. "Vern, did you get in?" I looked at the house one last time. I got in, Greer, and I found exactly what I needed. "What did you find, Vern?" "I found the price tag," I said. "I found out exactly what I'm worth to them, and I found out exactly what Elaine was worth." A pause. "Vern, you sound different." "I am different, Greer. The Vern who paid the bills is gone. The Vern who looked the other way is gone." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to that wedding, Greer, but not as a guest and not as a father." "Then what are you going as?" I turned the key. The engine caught with a deep, angry rumble that matched something in my chest. "I'm going as the repo man, Greer, and I'm coming to collect." The phone sat heavy in my hand as I swung the truck out onto the main boulevard. The city skyline climbed ahead of me, steel and glass cutting a jagged line against a blue sky. Somewhere in one of those towers was the office of Greer and Associates. And somewhere across the city in a ballroom draped in crystal and silk, my son was waiting on a check that had already dissolved into the digital ether. I pressed call again. The line rang with a hollow electronic tone. Greer picked up on the second ring. He sounded short of breath, like he'd been wearing a path in the carpet. "Vern," he said, "please tell me you didn't do anything reckless. Please tell me you walked in, looked around, and walked out." I moved into the center lane, eyes forward. "I didn't do anything reckless, Greer," I said, my voice level and cold. "I did something necessary. I have the evidence. The receipt is in my pocket right now." A pause, the sound of papers shifting on his end. "What kind of receipt, Vern?" "A pawn ticket," I said. "Capital City Pawn and Loan. They stripped the house, Greer. They took Elaine's paintings. They took her pearls. They took the watch I gave her when Colton was born. They didn't just take a few things, it was a liquidation. I heard Greer pull in a sharp breath. Oh God, Vern, I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry. I cut him off. Be a lawyer. I want you to open a file right now. Draft a criminal complaint. Grand larceny, theft of property over $5,000. I want the paperwork ready to file by Monday morning. I paused. But that's not all. Vern, slow down. Greer said, a warning edge in his voice. This is your son. Once criminal charges go in, there is no pulling them back. The district attorney takes the wheel. He could do real time. I squeezed the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. He sold his mother for one $200 Greer. He made his choice. Now I'm making mine. Write the complaint. I didn't give him room to push back. And Greer, one more thing. You have the trust documents in front of you? I do, he said. Page 14, Section 3, the Asset Recovery Clause. I heard pages turning. I knew that document by heart. I had written it myself 5 years ago, when I first started to understand that Colton had no real sense of what things cost. It was a fail-safe, a nuclear button I never believed I'd actually need to press. I see it, Greer said, his voice dropping. Vern, that clause, that's the one that lets you claw back any assets purchased with trust funds. If the beneficiary engages in criminal activity or gross misconduct, osminikasis, dafob. Activate it, I said. Vern, Greer said that means everything. The down payments, the furniture, the clothes on his back. If we can prove it came from the allowance money, you can legally seize all of it. I know exactly what it means, I said. Activate it. I want a lien on everything. I want his accounts frozen. I want his assets seized. I want him to open his eyes tomorrow morning and own nothing but the regret sitting in his chest. I'll get the team moving, Greer said. His voice had gone flat and resigned. He knew better than to argue when I used that particular tone, the tone I used when a subcontractor tried to cut corners on a foundation pour. The tone of a man about to tear the whole structure down. I was a breath away from hanging up when my phone gave a sharp beep. Call waiting. I pulled the phone from my ear and looked at the screen. Colton. I stared at the name. It didn't make me hopeful. It didn't stir anything warm. It just made me feel tired. Hold on, Greer, I said. The defendant is calling. I clicked over. I didn't say a word. I just listened. Dad! Colton's voice was high and shaking right on the edge of hysteria, loud and distorted, like he was screaming into the phone while moving at a run. Dad, you have to answer me. What did you do? I kept driving. I watched the traffic light bleed yellow, then snap to red. I eased the truck to a stop. I'm driving Colton, I said, steady and calm. What do you want? What do I want? He screamed. I'm at the Magnolia Grand. The manager just walked into the bridal suite. He pulled me out of the photos. He's got 2 security guards standing right behind him. He says the check bounced. He says the wire transfer was recalled. Dad, he is threatening to throw us out. He says if we don't have $85,000 in a cashier's check within 10 minutes, he's shutting the wedding down and calling the police for theft of services. I held my eyes on that red light, a deep burning crimson. Is that so? I said. Yes, Colton shrieked. He is serious, Dad. Brianna is hyperventilating. Her parents are out of their minds because the limo never showed up at the airport. Now they're in a cab somewhere stuck in traffic. Dad, you have to fix this. Call the bank. Tell them it was an error. Wire the money back. Please, everyone is already here. Guests are walking in right now. I listened to the noise bleeding through the phone. Brianna crying somewhere in the background. A low swell of voices. The sound of a catastrophe unfolding in real time. It wasn't an error, Colton, I said. The line went dead quiet. The background noise seemed to rise up to fill the space. What? He whispered. I canceled the check, I said. I called the bank this morning. I told them the transaction was unauthorized because it was. I authorized payment for a family wedding. I did not authorize payment for a performance I was banned from attending. But the wedding? Colton stammered. The guests, the food, it's all here. Then you'd better find a way to pay for it, I said. With what? He screamed. You cut off my credit cards. You took my car. You locked me out of my own house. I have nothing, Dad. I have literally nothing. I reached into my pocket and pressed my fingers against the pawn slip. Crisp paper. You have $1.200, I said. What? You have $1.200 Colton from the pawn shop. Use that. It ought to cover the appetizers. There was a gasp on the other end, a sharp, involuntary sound of pure shock. He hadn't known that I knew. He'd believed he was careful, believed he'd been invisible. "Dad, wait," he said, his voice collapsing to a terrified whisper. "I can't explain. It wasn't we were going to buy them back later. We needed cash for the tip envelopes. We were going to get them back, I swear." "You sold your mother," I said. My voice had dropped out of calm into something lower and harder. A growl. "You sold her to buy flowers for a woman who can't stand you. Don't you dare try to explain that to me." "Dad, please." Colton was sobbing now, a raw, ragged sound. "Please don't do this. They are going to put us out on the street in front of everyone." "I know," I said. "Dad, I am your son." "Not today," I said. "Today you're just a man who owes a great deal of money to people who have no interest in your excuses." "Dad, wait." I pulled the phone away from my ear. I looked at the screen one last time. Then I hit the red button. The call ended. The quiet settled back into the cab of the truck. The light turned green. I pressed the gas. The truck pushed forward, pointed at the Magnolia Grand. I wasn't going there to rescue him. I wasn't going there to settle the bill. I was going there to meet the officers Greer had called. I was going there to put a receipt into someone's hands and point a finger. I was going to a wedding, but I wasn't bringing a gift. I was bringing a reckoning. I pulled the Chevy Silverado up to the main entrance of the Magnolia Grand. The truck looked like a trespasser among the polished black sedans and rented limousines idling in the semicircular drive. Mud on the tires, a dent in the rear bumper from a job site accident 5 years back. It sat there with a deep, throaty idle that seemed to offend the very air of the place. The Magnolia Grand was a neoclassical showpiece towering Corinthian columns, a facade of white limestone that caught the afternoon sun and threw it back in your face, and a pair of massive mahogany and glass doors that made you feel small walking toward them. It was the kind of place engineered to make people feel significant simply by passing through its doors, the illusion of royalty available by the hour. I parked right on the red carpet and killed the engine. A valet in a burgundy vest came rushing over his face, pulled into a mask of professional alarm. He waved both arms at me as if shooing something that didn't belong. "Sir, you absolutely cannot leave your vehicle here," he said, rapping on my window. "This is a reserved zone for VIP arrivals. Deliveries go around the back. The loading dock is open until 3. I opened the door and climbed out. The valet stepped back and ran his eyes over me from the ground up. I had on the navy suit I'd pressed the evening before. My shoes, the ones I'd shined at the kitchen table, gleamed like polished stone. My tie was knotted with a clean, sharp dimple. I looked like a man who belonged in that suit, but the truck told a different story. To this kid, I was a disoriented contractor who'd taken a wrong turn on his way to a funeral. "I'm not a delivery driver, son," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried the full weight of 40 years of giving orders to men twice this kid's size. "Sir, I really cannot let that truck stay there," he sputtered. "The general manager is extremely strict. We have a high-profile wedding beginning in 30 minutes, the McCready wedding. If Mr. Calloway spots this truck on the carpet, he will let me go on the spot." I looked at the kid, young, scared, doing his job. I reached into my pocket and produced a $100 bill and pressed it into his palm. "If Calloway gives you any grief," I said, "tell him Vern said it was fine." The kid studied the money, then studied me. Confusion spread across his face. "Who's Vern?" he asked. "You'll find out," I said. I walked past him toward the big doors. A security guard stepped directly into my path. Broad shoulders, dark suit, earpiece. Arms folded across his chest. He didn't carry himself like the valet. He carried himself like a man who genuinely enjoyed being an obstacle. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice low and heavy. "May I see your invitation?" I stopped. I met his eyes. "I don't have one," I said. "And then I can't allow you inside," he said. "Private event, guest list only." "I'm the father of the groom," I said. The guard let a faint smirk move across his face, just a slight pull at the corner of his mouth, but I caught it. His eyes slid over to my truck, sitting on the red carpet, then down to my hands, rough, thick-knuckled, the hands of a man who'd spent a lifetime doing actual work. "Look, pal," he said, dropping the "sir." "I've been briefed. The bride and groom were very specific. They said there was a chance someone might try to get in without an invitation. Older man, disruptive. They said to keep him out, no exceptions." "Disruptive," I repeated. "That's right, disruptive. So, turn yourself around, get back in that truck and drive away before I'm calling the police for trespassing." I laughed. a dry, flat sound with nothing warm behind it. Trespassing, I said. That's rich. I looked at him evenly. I'm going to give you exactly one chance to step aside. The guard moved in closer. He had a few inches on me. Or what, old man? You gonna swing at me? As no, I said. I'm gonna fire you. He laughed out loud, a barking sound that bounced off the stone columns. You're gonna fire me? Who do you think you are? You're nobody. You're just some construction worker who got shut out by his own kid. Now get out of here. I didn't move. I drew a slow breath. I looked past him through the glass doors at the controlled chaos inside staff, moving at a near run, trays of champagne balanced in their hands. I could see the chandelier in the lobby, a massive crystal fixture that had cost $250,000. I knew the exact number because I had signed the invoice for it. "In get Calloway," I said. The guard shook his head slowly. "I'm not getting anybody. You've got 3 seconds to walk away." "Get Calloway," I said, and this time my voice came up from somewhere deep in my chest, the voice I'd used to make myself heard over the roar of jackhammers and cement mixers, the voice that didn't ask. It told. The guard flinched. A flicker of something uncertain moved through his eyes, something he hadn't planned on feeling. His hand went to his earpiece. "Mr. Calloway," he said quietly into the mic, eyes still fixed on mine. "We have a situation at the front entrance." "Yes, it's the man you flagged. He won't leave. He's asking for you personally." A pause while he'd listened. "Understood." He turned back to me with a satisfied smirk. "The boss is on his way out and he's bringing the off-duty officers we keep on retainer. You've just made yourself a very bad day." I stood my ground. I straightened my cuffs. I pressed a hand against the pocket where the pawn slip sat against my chest. Less than a minute passed before the doors swung wide. Calloway strode out. Tall, lean hair slicked flat, wearing a suit that cost more than my truck ever would. He looked rattled. There was sweat on his brow. He was likely running through how he'd explain a missing $85,000 to the people above him. He came flanked by 2 uniformed officers. The guard stepped to the side, presenting me like a trophy. "Here's the problem, Mr. Calloway. He dumped that wreck right on the red carpet and threatened my position. Want the officers to remove him?" Calloway stopped cold. He blinked. His eyes moved to the truck. Then they moved to me. The blood left his face so quickly I half expected him to drop. His mouth came open. Whatever angry words he'd loaded up died without a sound. He wasn't looking at a gatecrasher. He wasn't looking at a difficult father. He was looking at the man who cut his checks. The man who had purchased this very building 5 years ago when it was a struggling hotel and rebuilt it into the finest wedding venue in the state. The man who sat at the head of the quarterly board meetings and pressed him hard on margins and overhead. "Mr. McCready," Calloway stammered. It came out barely above a whisper. The guard shot Calloway a bewildered look. "Right, that's his name. McCready, the father. You want me to put him out?" Calloway wheeled on him. "Shut your mouth," he hissed. "Right now." He turned back toward me, smoothing the front of his jacket with hands that weren't steady. He bowed, not a casual nod, a full deferential bow. "Chairman McCready," he said, his voice uneven. I had no idea you were coming. We weren't notified of a visit. Is this a surprise inspection?" The guard's jaw went slack. The 2 officers exchanged a glance and eased their hands away from their belts, taking a quiet step back. "Chairman," the guard breathed. I looked at Calloway. I watched the sweat collecting on his upper lip. "Hello, Calloway," I said. "Looks like you're having some difficulty processing payment for today's event." Calloway flinched. "Yes, sir. A dreadful mix-up. The wire was reversed. We were just about to, we were on the verge of canceling the event. The couple is inside. They're beside themselves." "I know," I said. "I reversed the wire." Calloway's expression went blank, like something behind his eyes had tripped a breaker. You reversed it, sir." "But why?" "Because I don't pay for what I haven't received." "Calloway," I said. "And it seems I'm not welcome inside my own building." Calloway looked at the guard. The guard looked like he would have gladly sunk through the concrete. Sir Calloway said, "If I had known if anyone had told me you were the father, my God." The groom never mentioned it. "Of course he didn't," I said. "He's ashamed of me, Calloway. He thinks I'm a retired contractor, nothing more. He has no idea I own this place. He has no idea I own the holding company behind it. He thinks you answer to some faceless corporation." I moved forward a step. Calloway instinctively gave ground. "I'm going inside Calloway," I said. "Of course, sir." he said, hurrying ahead to hold the door. Right this way. Shall I clear the room? Do you want them removed? No, I said. Let them stay for now. I have a wedding to attend and a speech to give. I passed the guard on my way in. He was studying the floor, unwilling to raise his eyes. I stopped in front of him. You were doing your job, son, I said. You were following orders. But next time, find out who owns the pavement before you tell a man to get off it. I walked through the doors. The air conditioning met me, cool, clean, immediate. The lobby was something to behold. Marble underfoot, gold leaf pressed into the ceiling. A monument to excess, and I held the deed to every inch of it. From somewhere beyond the far wall, I could hear the ballroom, a string quartet playing something delicate and costly. Beneath it, the low hum of gathered guests. They were all in there. Brianna's family from New York, Colton's circle of friends, the people who had decided they were above me, drinking my champagne, standing on my floors, celebrating a marriage built on my money without the first clue that the man who owned the room had just walked in to collect what was owed. I moved toward the ballroom doors. Calloway fell in beside me, hovering like a nervous dog. Sir, he murmured, the officers the ones you requested. They're waiting in the manager's office. Good, I said. Keep them there. Wait for my signal. Signal, sir. When I set the microphone down, I said, that's the signal. I reached for the handles of the double doors. I could feel the quartet's bass resonating through the wood. It was time. I pushed through into the grand ballroom, and the music rolled over me like a wave of expensive perfume. The room was extraordinary. A cavern of gold leaf and crystal lit by chandeliers that cost more than most people took home in 10 years. The tables gleamed with fine china and heavy silverware. The centerpieces were soaring towers of white orchids and hydrangeas, the very flowers bought with the money from my wife's stolen locket. I held still for a moment, just inside the entrance, letting my eyes find their footing in the brilliance. I took in the guests, hundreds of them, men in tuxedos, women in designer gowns holding their champagne flutes by the stem and laughing with their chins raised. These were the people my son had been so determined to impress that he had scrubbed his own father out of existence to do it. And there at the center of everything on a raised platform under a single spotlight stood Brianna. She looked beautiful. I'll give her that much. Her gown was a masterpiece of lace and silk, the kind of thing that carries a price tag with several zeros. She held a microphone in one hand, the other pressed theatrically to her chest. She was speaking, her voice carefully threaded with emotion, so convincingly it nearly turned my stomach. It is such a tragedy. She was saying her words floating across the room through a first-rate sound system. We wanted him here so much. Colton is heartbroken, but you have to understand his father has been carrying some very difficult personal struggles for a long time. I stepped out from the shadow of the entrance. I began walking down the center aisle. The carpet was thick, swallowing every footfall. Mental health is such a silent struggle. Brianna went on, pressing a finger to her cheek where no tear existed. We tried to get him help. We tried to bring him in, but he isn't himself anymore. He's become unpredictable, dangerous even. So for the safety of everyone here, we had to make the painful decision to let him remain at home where he'd be comfortable. A wave of sympathy moved through the crowd. Poor Colton, poor Brianna, saddled with a volatile old man on their wedding day. I kept walking, no rush, moving with the quiet, inevitable force of something that cannot be turned aside. Colton stood a few steps from Brianna, head lowered in a portrait of grief. He was holding the pose perfectly, accepting the room's silent commiseration. Then he looked up. He saw me. His eyes blew wide. His jaw came unhinged. The sorrow evaporated, replaced in an instant by naked, uncut panic. He moved as if to step between us, then stopped dead. He'd seen how I was walking. He'd clocked the set of my shoulders. He'd seen the navy suit on me, fitted like armor. He nudged Brianna. She stopped mid-sentence. She tracked his gaze. When she found me, the color drained from her face. The microphone tilted in her grip. The silence that dropped over that room was absolute. It started at the front, where the two of them stood locked in place and rolled backward like a shockwave until every head in the house turned to see what had struck the bride dumb. The string quartet dissolved into a dissonant scrape of bow on string. I didn't stop. I passed the tables where Brianna's family was seated. Her father, Prescott, a man whose flight I'd paid $12,000 to arrange, sat with his mouth hanging open, a forkful of salmon, frozen halfway to his face. Her mother, Nadine, regarded me the way someone looks at vermin that has just appeared on a dinner table. I moved past the friends Colton had collected in college, the ones whose cars came courtesy of their parents. They watched me with puzzled curiosity. Who's this old man? Is he with the venue? Did he wander in? I reached the base of the stage steps. Colton made his move. He came to the edge of the platform, both hands raised. "Dad!" he hissed, barely loud enough to cut through the ambient hum of the sound system. "Dad, don't. Please just turn around. We can still talk." I didn't look at him. I looked past him straight at Brianna. I took the steps. 1, 2, 3. I was on the stage. The spotlight was blinding hot, relentless, like something out of a police interrogation. I crossed to where Brianna stood. She retreated from me step by step, clutching the microphone against her chest like it might protect her. She shot Colton a desperate look, but Colton was frozen solid. He understood. He knew that any move he made now would only fan the flames. "Give me the microphone, Brianna," I said. My voice wasn't amplified, but in the absolute stillness of that room, it traveled every inch. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "Get out. Security, someone get security." "There is no security, Brianna," I said. "Or rather, the security answers to me. Now hand it over." I extended my hand, palm up. No grab, no lunge. Just an open hand. An invitation with the weight of a command behind it. She looked to the crowd. She looked at her parents. She looked toward the exits. The trap was clear. If she wrestled me for it, she'd look unhinged. If she screamed, she'd look hysterical. She was caught in her own need to appear composed and untouchable. Shaking, she surrendered the microphone. I took it. It had some weight to it. It felt right in my grip. It felt like authority. I turned to face the room. A sea of faces stared back at me. Hundreds of strangers who had formed their opinion of me from a story built on lies. I tapped the head of the mic. Thump, thump. The sound rolled through the ballroom like a thunderclap, rattling the crystals overhead. "Good afternoon," I said. My voice came out low, and even the voice of a man who has spent decades projecting over the noise of heavy machinery. "I apologize for the disruption. I know the speeches were going well. I know the wine is going down smoothly. The vintage is excellent, by the way. I should know I chose it." I caught Calloway, the manager, standing near the kitchen doors. He gave me a small, barely visible nod. He'd handled it. The doors were sealed. Nobody was walking in to pull this curtain down. "My name is Vern McCready," I said. "And despite what you have just been told, I am not wrestling with demons. I am not unstable. I am not dangerous unless you consider speaking the truth to be a form of violence." A sharp intake of breath moved through the room. People shifted. This wasn't on the program. This was something real, and they all felt it pulling them forward. "I am Colton's father." I continued gesturing toward my son, who was now standing with both hands pressed over his face, looking like he was praying for the floor to open beneath him. "And the reason I wasn't here earlier, the reason I wasn't sitting in the front row where a father belongs, is quite straightforward." I paused. I let the quiet do its work. I let them sit with the question. "I wasn't invited," I said. The murmur that followed was immediate. Shock. Disbelief washing through every table. "Last night I received a text message from my son." I said it plainly. A very courteous text. It explained that his fiancée, Brianna, felt my presence would prove to be a distraction. It explained that because I spent 40 years earning my living with my hands, because I drive a truck and wear flannel shirts, I was too blue-collar for an occasion like this. I was told I would embarrass them in front of all of you, in front of her sophisticated family. I fixed my gaze on Brianna's parents. Prescott set his fork down. Nadine looked as though she'd bitten into something rotten. "They told me I didn't belong," I said. "They told me I wasn't fit to share in their happiness. But here is the part that matters. Here is what I need every person in this room to hear." I reached into my jacket and drew out the folded sheet of paper, the printed wire transfer confirmation. I unfolded it with deliberate slowness. The paper crinkled in the silence like something alive. "Because even though I wasn't good enough to be here," I said, holding it up to the light, "I was apparently good enough to foot the bill." I read from the page. "Wire transfer, amount $85,000. Recipient the Magnolia Grand, sender Vernon McCready." I lowered it. "I paid for the champagne you're drinking," I said. "I paid for the lobster on your plates. I paid for the band. I paid for the flowers. I paid for the very floor beneath your feet." I turned to face Colton. He was weeping now, silent, steady tears working their way down his face. "You wanted a perfect wedding, Colton," I said. "You wanted to play the prince. But you forgot one thing. A prince doesn't banish the king who built the castle. I turned back to the crowd. I'm a plain man, I said. I built everything I have on honesty, on hard work, on keeping my word. I believed I had handed those same things down to my son. I thought I had raised a man. It appears I raised a parasite instead. The room erupted into chaos. Whispers, pointed fingers, people reaching for their phones. Brianna was sobbing openly now, both hands covering her face. But that isn't even the worst of it, I said. My voice shifted, the grief burned off, and what was left was cold and precise, like a blade drawn clean. Because when I reversed that payment this morning, when I decided I would not fund my own humiliation, my son and his wife didn't come to find me. They didn't come to ask for forgiveness. They went to the house I had given them to live in rent-free. They broke in, and they stole from me. I reached into my breast pocket. I drew out the yellow pawn slip. This is a receipt from a pawn shop, I said, holding it where the room could see it. Dated yesterday. They took the paintings my late wife had made with her own hands. They took her jewelry. They took the watch I gave her the year our son was born. They took the last tangible pieces of a woman who loved them with everything she had, and they sold them. They sold her memory for $200 to buy more flowers for the head table. I turned and pointed at the towering arrangement of orchids behind me. Those flowers, I said, my voice fracturing at the edges. Those flowers were purchased with my wife's soul. The room went completely still. The horror was real, and it hung in the air like something with weight. Even the waitstaff had gone motionless. So, no, I said, pulling my voice down to a quiet that still reached the back wall. I am not sick. I am not out of my mind. I am simply a father who has finished paying for the right to be treated with contempt. I looked at Calloway. I gave him a nod. I set the microphone down on the stage floor. It hit with a concussive boom that shook the room. That was the sound of a door closing. That was the signal. The double doors at the rear of the ballroom swung open hard. 2 uniformed officers came through at a march. Not the posture of venue security, but the bearing of the law itself. Handcuffs on their belts, gravity on their faces. The crowd split for them down the center aisle, the way water parts around something that cannot be stopped. They came straight for the stage. I looked at Colton. He looked at the officers. Then he looked at me. He mouthed the word, Dad. I turned my back on him. I came down off the stage. I walked right past those officers without a word. I was through talking. The debt had matured, and it was time to collect. The silence in the ballroom was dense enough to press against your skin. The echo of that dropped microphone was still bouncing off the gilded ceiling when Prescott, Brianna's father, shoved back his chair. The legs shrieked across the floor like nails dragged over glass. His face had gone a deep mottled purple, the shade that comes over a man who has always bought his way clear of consequences and has just understood that no amount of money applies here. He leveled a trembling finger in my direction. Officer! He bellowed, his voice grasping for an authority it no longer carried. Officer, remove this man at once. He is trespassing. He is harassing my daughter. He is clearly out of his mind. This is a private family occasion, and he is destroying it. I looked at Prescott. I took in the 3,000 suit straining at every button. I clocked the gold watch on his wrist, the kind that costs more than my first house did. And I felt nothing, no unease, no deference. Only the cool, clean clarity of a man who has read the credit reports. I stepped down off the stage. I didn't head for the exit. I headed for Prescott. The officers held their position waiting. They knew who had placed the call. They knew who the wrong party was. I came to a stop at Prescott's table. I set both hands on the white tablecloth and leaned in close enough to catch the scotch coming off his breath. Sit down, Prescott, I said. He blinked, thrown by being given an order. Excuse me. Sit down, I said again. Unless you'd like me to brief these officers on the shell company in Delaware, or the 3 active fraud lawsuits in New York, or the fact that the Hamptons townhouse went into foreclosure 6 months ago. Nadine sucked in a sharp breath, one hand flying to her necklace. How dare you, she whispered. That is a lie. Is it, Nadine? I asked, holding her gaze. Is it a lie that you burned through your last credit card buying those plane tickets? Is it a lie that you're banking on your daughter marrying into money so she can dig you out of the hole you've spent years digging? The room fell dead quiet again. The guests who, moments ago, had been murmuring about me were now staring at the bride's parents with an entirely different kind of horror. The surface was fracturing. The gold lacquer was coming away to show what was rotting underneath. You see, I went on, letting my voice reach the nearby tables. I did my research. When my son told me his fiancée came from wealth, I looked into it because that is what any man in business does. And do you know what? I turned up smoke and mirrors. A family every bit as broke as my son, just better dressed. From the stage, Brianna let out a strangled cry. "Stop it!" she screamed. "Stop talking!" I turned back toward her. She was shaking so violently the lace on her gown was trembling. She had the look of something cornered. "We are not finished, Brianna," I said. "Not yet." I reached into my pocket again. The pawn slip came out, but I didn't put it away this time. I flipped it over. Stapled to the back was a second receipt, smaller, printed on pink thermal paper. "You see," I said, holding it up, "pawn shops keep thorough records. When you bring in stolen goods, they photograph your ID. And when you happen to be purchasing something else at the same counter, the receipts get stapled together." I moved back toward the stage. The officers fell in alongside me, flanking me like an escort. Colton was staring at the floor. He couldn't bring himself to look at me. He couldn't look at Brianna either. He was collapsing inward, disappearing from the inside out. But Brianna's eyes were locked on the pink paper in my hand, wide, fixed, unblinking. She knew exactly what it was. I climbed the steps one final time. I stood beside her. I looked at her dress. It was a remarkable thing. Layers of white silk, hand-stitched lace, a train that pooled around her feet like a low cloud. The dress of a princess. "It's a beautiful gown, Brianna," I said. She didn't respond. She was pulling air in shallow, rapid sips. "Must have cost a fortune," I continued. I glanced at the pink receipt. $4,500, I read. "A cash payment made yesterday afternoon at the bridal boutique on Westheimer Road. The final installment to release the dress from alterations." I looked out at the crowd. "My son told me Brianna had purchased this dress months ago," I said. "He told me her parents covered it." "That was a lie. Her parents couldn't cover a sandwich." Prescott made a sound low in his throat, but he didn't rise from his chair. He sat there diminished. "So, where did the money come from?" I asked. "How does a couple with no income and frozen accounts produce $4,500 in cash on a Tuesday afternoon?" I raised the pawn slip. "They got it from the pawn shop," I said. I looked at Brianna. I looked at the diamond studs in her ears, the tennis bracelet on her wrist. "They sold my wife's engagement ring," I said, and for the first time my voice broke on the words. "The ring I proposed with in 1981. The ring she wore for 35 years. They cracked open the safe in the closet and took it." A collective gasp moved through the crowd. There are violations people understand in their bones. This was one of them. This wasn't theft. This was desecration. "And they sold it," I said, my voice rising to fill every corner of the room. "They sold 40 years of marriage. They sold the emblem of my life with Elaine. And do you know what they spent the money on?" I leveled a shaking finger at Brianna. "They bought a dress. They bought a costume for a liar." Brianna looked down at herself. She stared at the white silk as though it had turned to hot coals against her skin. She tried to back away, caught her heel in the train, and stumbled, grabbing Colton's arm to steady herself. "Get off me!" Colton snapped, shoving her aside. The gesture hit the room like a slap, the groom recoiling from his bride at the altar. Brianna lurched back. "You knew!" she screamed at him. "You drove the car. You waited outside. Don't stand there pretending you had no part in it." "I didn't know you sold the ring," Colton shouted back, his face burning red and contorted. "You told me it was just the old silver. You told me the ring was safe." "You are a liar," she shrieked. "You needed the money just as badly as I did." "Enough," I said. One word, and it split right through them. I turned to the officers. "Gentlemen," I said, "I am Vernon McCready. I own the property on Sycamore Lane, and I own every item listed on this pawn ticket. These two individuals broke into my home. They removed property worth in excess of $50,000 and sold it. I handed the receipts to the senior officer, a sergeant gray-haired with the face of a man who had absorbed too many years of this exact kind of ugliness. He studied the papers. He studied the dates. He read the names, Colton McCready and Brianna Whitley, he said aloud. "Yes," I said. "That's them. I want to press charges, full extent of the law." The sergeant gave a single nod. He stepped forward and reached for his belt. "Colton McCready, Brianna Whitley." His voice was loud and official now. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, burglary, and trafficking in stolen property." The handcuffs came out with a sharp metallic snap. Click, click. Colton's legs buckled. He went down onto the stage sobbing. "Dad, no. Dad, please. Not here. Not in front of all these people." Get on your feet, son, the officer said, hauling him upright by the arm. Hands behind your back. Colton looked at me. His eyes were stripped bare. Dad, stop this. I'll pay you back. I'll work. I'll do whatever it takes. Just make them stop. I looked at him. I looked at the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the boy I had spent a lifetime shielding from every hard edge the world had to offer, and I understood right then that the shielding had been the worst thing I had ever done. You can't pay me back, Colton, I said, keeping my voice quiet. The ring is gone, the paintings are gone, and the trust is gone. You're on your own now. The officer turned him around and locked the cuffs onto his wrists. The sound was final. A life splitting cleanly into two halves. Everything before this moment and everything after. Brianna was fighting. She was scrambling to run, but the weight of her train worked against her. The second officer caught her. She screamed, kicking, scratching. My dress, she wailed. You're ruining my dress. It's not your dress, the officer said, spinning her around. It's evidence. He cuffed her. She stood there, chest-heaving mascara, tracking down her face in dark lines, staring at her parents in the front row. Daddy, she cried. Help me, do something. Prescott looked at her. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the officers. He lifted his napkin and pressed it to the corner of his mouth. He didn't stand. He didn't utter a single word. He understood that if he called attention to himself right now, the next pair of handcuffs might be intended for him. The officers guided them across the stage and down the steps. The walk of shame felt endless. The guests stood aside in silence, watching the bride and groom, escorted out not toward a honeymoon suite, but toward a squad car. The white gown swept the floor, picking up dust, a symbol of purity being dragged through the wreckage of their own choices. I stood alone on the stage. The room held its breath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They were all waiting for an apology, for an explanation, for something to ease the pressure that had built up and not yet released. But I had nothing left to give them. I looked at Calloway. He was pale, but he held himself upright. He knew whose signature was on his paycheck. Clear the room, Calloway, I said. This is over. Calloway gave a nod and signaled the staff. I descended the stairs. I didn't let my eyes go to the empty spot where my son had been standing. I didn't look at the bride's mother weeping in her seat. I walked the length of the center aisle. Each step felt heavy. I felt old. I felt worn down to the bone. But underneath all of that, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of the secret, the weight of the disappointment, both of them gone. I pushed through the double doors into the lobby, walked out through the front entrance, and stepped into the open air. The squad cars were sitting out front, their lights throwing blue and red against the white limestone facade. They were loading Colton into the back of one car and Brianna into another. I didn't stop to watch any of it. I walked to my truck. It was still sitting right there on the red carpet, stubborn and ugly and completely real. I got in, fired, the engine dropped it into gear, and pulled away. I never looked in the rearview mirror, didn't need to. I already knew what was back there, wreckage. But ahead of me, the road lay open. And for the first time in longer than I could account for, it was mine. The fluorescent lights in the precinct interview room buzzed with a pitch that bored straight into the back of my skull. Quite a shift from the string quartet and crystal chandeliers of an hour before. No champagne here. No flowers. Nothing but gray cinder block walls. A steel table anchored to the floor, and the smell of industrial cleaner losing its battle against sweat and fear. I sat on a metal chair spine, straight hands folded on the table. I watched the door. I waited. When the guard finally brought Colton through, I barely placed him. The tuxedo that had looked so sharp on that stage was a crumpled ruin now. Collar undone, tie gone. His face was mottled and raw, his eyes swollen nearly shut. He wasn't walking like a man. He was shuffling, shoulders caved, as though he were trying to fold himself down small enough to vanish entirely. He lowered himself into the chair across from me. The guard shackled his wrist to the table ring. The metal clinked loud in that small room. Colton looked up. When his eyes found mine, his face fell to pieces. He looked the way he had at 5 years old, just taken a hard spill off his bike on the sidewalk. Dad, he choked. Oh God, Dad, thank you for coming. Please get me out of here. It's a nightmare in there. There's a guy in the holding cell who won't stop screaming. I can't do this. I can't stay here. I said nothing. I just looked at him. I searched for the arrogance he had shown me in my own driveway that morning, the defiance that was on his face when he'd changed the locks on my house. It was nowhere. It had dissolved the instant those handcuffs snapped shut. Dad, Colton said, straining forward as far as the chain would give him. You have to post bail. The lawyer said it gets set in the morning. Just cover it, please. I'll pay you back every dollar. I swear I'll get a job. I'll do whatever you say. Just get me out. I leaned back. The metal was cold through my jacket. I'm not here to post your bail, Colton, I said. He went perfectly still. His mouth came open. What? I came to say goodbye, I said. Goodbye? He repeated, his voice hollow. Dad, what does that mean? You can't just leave me in here. I can, I said, and I am. But it wasn't my fault. He burst out, the words tumbling over one another in a flood of panic. It was Brianna. You know how she is, Dad. She is obsessed with how things look. She kept saying we needed the money for the wedding. She said you'd never notice the jewelry. She said the paintings were just old junk sitting there. I tried to stop her, Dad. I told her it was wrong, but she wouldn't hear it. She pushed me into it. I sat there and listened to him throw her to the wolves. The woman he had stood up and vowed to love and cherish less than 2 hours ago was already just a shield for him to crouch behind. He'd been prepared to sacrifice me to protect his standing in a crowd, and now he was prepared to sacrifice her to protect his skin. It was pathetic. It was the most spineless thing I had ever witnessed up close. Stop, I said. He stopped, chest heaving. Do you hear what's coming out of your mouth? I asked. You are a grown man, Colton. You are 28 years old, and you are sitting in a police precinct telling me that a woman talked you into robbing your own father. You are telling me you have no backbone, no will, and no sense of what's right. I loved her, he whispered, the words barely holding together. You didn't love her, I said. You loved the image she gave you. You loved that having her on your arm made you feel like somebody. And you loved my money because it was the thing that kept her interested. But love isn't theft, Colton, and a marriage isn't a scheme to commit larceny. Dad, please, he sobbed, dropping his face into his free hand. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I know I destroyed everything. But prison? Dad, I can't go to prison. I'm not built for this. I looked at him, and the terrible thing was, he was right. He wasn't. He was soft all the way through, the kind of softness that comes from never once being made to struggle for anything. I had laid such a smooth road in front of him that he had never once learned how to walk on gravel. That was on me. That was the one genuine sin I had to own. That, I said, is precisely why you need to stay. He looked up at me, tears sliding off his chin. Why do you hate me? He whispered. I don't hate you, I said. I love you. That's the whole tragedy of this. I love you enough to let you hit the ground. I stood up. The chair scraped hard across the concrete. For 28 years I protected you, I said, looking down at him. I absorbed every consequence. I settled every debt. I smoothed over every mistake. And this is what it produced. It produced a thief. It produced a liar. It produced a man who would sell his mother's memory to decorate a head table. Dad, no. I am doing you a kindness, Colton, I said. I'm giving you the one thing I never once gave you before this moment. Reality. There is no safety net. There is no checkbook riding to your rescue. There is only you and the law. But Brianna, he cried out. What about Brianna? Brianna is in a cell block down this hall, I said. And if she has any sense at all, she's blaming you right now, the same way you just blamed her. The two of you deserve each other. I turned toward the door. Dad, wait! Colton screamed, yanking against the chain. Dad, please don't go. I'm scared. Please. I stopped. My hand rested on the door handle. I looked back at him one last time. Good, I said. Being scared is the beginning of growing up. And growing up is the only thing that's going to get you through this. I knocked on the heavy steel door. The guard opened it from outside. Ah, Dad, Colton shouted, his voice breaking apart completely. Dad, come back. I walked out into the hallway. The door came shut behind me with a dense metallic thud that cut him off mid-cry. I stood there a moment in the silence that followed. It was heavy. It hurt in a way that is hard to describe, like something had been surgically removed. But it also felt right in the way that necessary things sometimes do. I walked down the hall past the booking desk, past the officers hunched over their coffee cups. I walked out into the night. The city was still at it, lights, sirens, the whole restless machinery of the world grinding forward. I went to my truck, got in, sat there a long time with both hands on the wheel, going nowhere. I had lost a son today. But somewhere on the far side of this, when those gates opened and he walked out, maybe a man would walk out in his place. And if that happened, it would be worth every cent of the $85,000 I had never spent. I started the engine, dropped it into gear. I drove away from that precinct and left my boy behind to learn the hardest lesson his life had waiting for him. School was in session. It took 30 days to strip the stain of that betrayal out of my life. 30 days of attorney meetings, paperwork, and silence. The silence was the worst of it at first. The phone sat quiet. No texts fishing for money, no frantic calls about busted pipes or cards run dry. For a solid week, I was checking the screen every hour, pure reflex. But the second week, I stopped reaching for it. And by the third week, something shifted. I understood that the silence wasn't emptiness. It was peace. I went back to the pawn shop the Monday following the wedding. The owner, a guy named Sal, looked at me with a blend of respect and wariness when I came through the door. He'd seen the news. The whole city had seen the news. I set the ticket on the counter alongside a stack of hundreds. No haggling, no argument over the interest. I just wanted my life returned to me. Sal brought everything out from the safe. Elaine's pearls, the gold watch, the paintings. I unwrapped the canvas of the lake house. I dragged my thumb across the dried oil paint, feeling the ridges and grooves her brush had pressed into it 20 years ago. They were safe. They were back where they belonged. But I didn't carry them home. My house was too hollow now, and I was finished living inside a shrine to what was gone. I brought the jewelry to a high-end auction house and delivered the paintings to a gallery that handled local artists. I wasn't after the money. I had enough of that. I needed the energy around all of it to change. I sold the house on Sycamore Lane 3 days after that. It went to a young couple, a mechanic and a nurse who came through the front door and looked at the place like they had stumbled into something they'd only dreamed about. They didn't push for upgrades. They didn't pick at the fixtures. They just held each other's hands and talked about where the crib would go. I let it go for 10% under market value simply because I liked the calluses on the husband's hands. When the house proceeds cleared and the auction house wired the funds from the jewelry, I took every single cent and opened a new account, the Elaine McCready Scholarship Fund. It was for kids who wanted to go to trade school, kids who wanted to learn how to weld, how to plumb, how to put things together that would actually last. It was the finest investment I had ever made. Now I was settled into seat 2A of a Boeing 787. The leather was soft, far softer than anything in my truck. The air carried that particular scent of conditioned oxygen and expensive cologne. Mr. McCready, a flight attendant said, leaning toward me with a bottle swathed in a white napkin. "May I offer you a glass of champagne before we depart?" Or body stummed a ftalk. I looked at the bottle. Dom Perignon, the same label that had been sitting open and going flat on the counter of the house my son had torn apart. I felt a smile come. "Yes," I said. "I'd very much like one." She poured the golden liquid into a crystal flute. The bubbles climbed fast, racing each other to the surface, as if they couldn't wait to get free. I took the glass. It sat light in my palm. I looked out the window. The tarmac was alive with baggage carts and fuel trucks. Men in neon vests doing the hard, unglamorous work that keeps the world moving. Past the airport boundary, the city of Houston spread out below, its grid of gray and green rolling away to the horizon. Somewhere down in that city in a county facility, my son was sitting with a plea hearing ahead of him. He was learning to make his own bed, learning that what a man does carries weight and momentum. I wasn't angry anymore. The fury that had powered me through the day of the wedding had burned all the way down and left something clean in its place. I had done what I was supposed to do. I had raised him. I had provided for him. When he lost his way, I had put a correction in front of him. What he did with it was his business now. The plane began to push back from the gate, the engines winding up from a whine to a full-floor vibrating roar. I took a sip of the champagne, cold, bright, precise. It tasted like victory. Not the kind that comes from grinding someone else down, the kind that comes from taking yourself back. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I looked at it one final time. No missed calls, no unread messages. I held the power button until the screen went dark. I tucked the phone into my bag and zipped it closed. I wouldn't be needing it for a while. I was going to Italy. Elaine had always wanted to see the Amalfi Coast. She wanted to paint the way the light fell on the water there. We never went because I was always buried in work, always building something for a son who had no use for it. Well, I was going now. I was going to eat pasta and drink wine and stand at the edge of the ocean. I was going to sleep until noon if it suited me. I was going to spend my money building memories I could actually hold on to. The plane rolled toward the runway. The pilot came over the intercom with our flight time to Rome. I let my head settle back against the headrest and close my eyes. For 66 years, I had been Vern the contractor, Vern the husband, Vern the father, Vern the bank account. Today I was just Vern. The engines climbed to full power. The force pressed me back into my seat. We built speed faster and faster until the juddering of the runway smoothed away and the ground simply dropped from beneath us. I opened my eyes and looked out the window. The city had disappeared, folded under a layer of white cloud. Above them, the sun blazed brilliant absolute. I lifted my glass toward the empty seat beside me. "Here's to you, Elaine," I said quietly. "And here's to me." I drank. The champagne sparkled all the way down. And that is where I leave you tonight. At the top of those clouds, champagne in hand, flying toward a coast my wife never got to see. This story cost me a son, at least the version of him I thought I had raised. It cost me a house full of memories and a year of silence that felt like an open wound. But I believe God does not allow that kind of pain without also clearing a path through it. What I found on the other side was something I had not felt in years. Dignity, my own name standing on its own 2 feet. If there is anything this family revenge story leaves with you, let it be this. First, never let what you have built be used as a weapon against you. Know what you own and be willing to take it back. Second, protecting someone from every consequence is not love. It is a slow harm. Let the people you care about feel the weight of their own choices. Third, when you have been wronged, gather your proof quietly. Silence is not weakness, it is preparation. Fourth, for every adult's 50-plus listener who has ever felt invisible, overlooked, or written off by the younger generation, your experience is not a liability. It is a lever. Use it. If this story moved something in, you leave a comment and tell me which moment hit hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. A friend, a parent, anyone who has ever been underestimated by the people they love most. And if you are not yet subscribed to Honor Revenge Stories, now is a good time. Thank you for listening all the way through. It means more than you know. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other.